right. Well, yay for having some extra time. All right. Welcome, everybody. I'm Roxane Boonstra. I'm the dive training administrator for the Coral Restoration Foundation. It's an odd title, but I standardize our in-water training for our staff, our interns, our volunteers, and I also run our external-facing recreational dive programs. Originally, I wanted to report on these, but COVID kind of wrecked my data set, so I'm still going to talk about them, but I'm also want to create a discussion about ecotourism and voluntourism in general now as part of this session. Now, these phrases, ecotourism and voluntourism, are very often used synonymously. And while they do have overlap, they are two different terms. Ecotourism is indicating a person who wants to have a highly interactive experience with a particular environment. But a volunteer tourist or a voluntourist is an ecotourist, but with the added altruistic component. And recognizing that particular aspect of this person is what I want to dive into today. Now, we all recognize the really harsh reality that as local managers, wherever you may be, our ability to mitigate big problems like climate change or even water quality for us here in Florida are really not possible. Our voices are few, and they're very, very directed towards our issues that we're focused on, like coral restoration. So since our voices are so few, that's why we need to harness the voices of others to not speak for us, but with us. And when I say us, I mean anyone in this restoration practicing community. More education and empowerment ultimately means more positive trickle-up effects on big things like legislation, on creating behavioral and cultural change and attitudes wherever that might be, and to increase opportunities for career awareness and pathways for youth who are taking on this next generation. There's a lot of other advantages as well. For a restoration organization, a group can help increase your capacity for effort. It can also help to decrease some of your conservation costs and your effort costs. From a community perspective, it can have a huge positive effect on the local economy, and it can also create an incredibly strong sense of stewardship and ownership that people want to gravitate towards and be involved in. Unfortunately, there's also a lot of disadvantages. Now, I know that sometimes it's easier to gloss over these or to complain about them or make a joke about them, but I kind of want to air them here in this session and hopefully outside of this session, not to rebuke voluntourism efforts and programs, but to just air and recognize their vices, while also trying to find ways to increase and recognize their merits. So we could spend an hour talking about all of these, but these are the ones that I tend to think about the most with regards to work with Coral Restoration Foundation. Though it's nominal in comparison to climate change, diver effect is very, very real. Lots of studies have shown us this. Secondly, voluntourism comes with, not my word, someone else's word, but occasional narcissistic tendencies, where it's kind of hard to avoid that because it's that same narcissistic tendency that's driven someone to want to give their time and money and effort towards this. But sometimes it can definitely feel like you're catering more to their interest than to the effort's interest. Scuba diving and certainly a career in conservation is kind of inherently privileged. And so we tend to edge out entire sectors of the population, both from minority, underserved, underprivileged groups who not only have something to learn, but to also contribute. And then lastly, with a lot of the globalization that we're seeing, I think we run a real risk of trying to copy paste programs. So just because one is successful somewhere over here doesn't mean that we can take it and force it on this group over here in favor of the tourist experience rather than the communities. So let's take a look at the Florida Keys, right? They obviously very much believe in the strength of our coral reefs as a tourism asset. So understanding that demographic and what makes our tourists tick can be helpful. Looking at total visitor volume to the Florida Keys and Key West from 2014 to 2018, we see about 5 million people come through these islands every single year. And in 2018, interestingly, most of those people were actually from Florida itself. Another study in 2019 over 2020 tells us that a group of surveyed people said that 21% of them joined in scuba diving and another 30 to 65% of them participated in snorkeling. It's a lot of people. In the Florida Keys, we have 4 different restoration organizations. There's Moat Marine down in the Lower Keys, we have iCare, Reef Renewal, and Coral Restoration Foundation in the Upper Keys. Those are our headquarters. We all work up and down the Keys for the most part under Mission Iconic Reefs. We all offer education and voluntourism opportunities in some capacity. Some of them are more science-focused, some of them are large-scale focused, but regardless, we're all working under this coral restoration umbrella towards a common goal. CRF has long-term opportunities for volunteers as well as our interns, but not everyone can make that time and financial commitment. So we've also developed short-term programs that we call our recreational dive programs. These are facilitated through local dive operators or coordinated with private groups, and they're really designed to be one or multi-day experiential programs for people to understand what's happening to our coral reefs, what is being done about it, and where can they get involved. Now, amazingly, for some reason I don't understand, not everybody dedicates a full day to marine conservation on their holiday. So instead, CRF has been working with the Blue Star program as part of the Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary to assist in the development of a shorter experience that will allow operators and visitors increased access to restoration. If anybody doesn't know about the Blue Star program, there is another session going on about it right now. I'd be happy to introduce you to them. It's a fascinating program. In 2017 and 2018, we surveyed interested volunteers who wanted to be with CRF. And if you were here in Reef Futures 2018, some of this data might look familiar to you. But for us, ideally, a long-term volunteer lives within a 1 to 2 hour drive of CRF somewhere. And we can see from our data that somewhere between 25 and 60% of interested volunteers do not fit that qualification. But they do make prime candidates for our recreational dive programs. Similarly, we want our long-term interns and volunteers to have at least 30 dives in the last 5 years. And again, not including snorkelers, at least 25% of the people who were divers and interested in working with us did not fit this qualification. But we could direct them towards this other program. So CRF has a dedicated education department that focuses on these programs. And so this data told us loud and clear that there was the customer base and interest to ramp up these public programs. So since 2016, we've seen quite a bit of growth in the participation in these programs. And in 2019, about over half of our calendar year was actually scheduled and booked for these recreational dive programs. But to highlight an advantage-disadvantage that I mentioned earlier, we see that these programs do not necessarily provide, keyword here, consistent restoration outplant goals for us. This is because these programs are highly weather dependent. They are incredibly time limited. And as anyone who works in the restoration field knows, there is a high learning curve. And these are introductory experiences for people. However, the overall feeling that people get from this interactive experience, whether they're outplanting or they're just cleaning trees in a nursery or they're just learning, is unparalleled for a lot of them. Here we see sound bites. Don't worry too much about it, but essentially we wanted to see what are people taking home as far as messaging over the years. And this is where I'd hope to see some changes and takeaways over the years. But what this tells me is that people are absorbing a lot of a little bit of everything. If I had to pick one, it's that Florida has lost up to 97% of its coral reefs. Except for this person in 2018, who apparently learned nothing. But that's okay, because they did later on say in the survey that they had a fabulous experience and they would absolutely join again. Go figure. So what this tells us is that our divers, loud and clear, and snorkelers want to be good, impactful, positive stewards and ocean ambassadors, which supports our program's primary goal of inspiring behavioral change and empowering people to speak about this. So as restoration becomes increasingly globalized, voluntourism programs will continue to increase. So internally, CRF is trying to take a few different directions here. We see from our data that people are absorbing a lot of information and walking away with a positive experience. But an overly hopeful message can work to our disadvantage. We don't want people thinking, they got this, right? So our messaging kind of shifts to be a little bit more transparent, that restoration might not succeed in the face of climate change, that mortality will happen, that we can't restore back to something, we're restoring to a new and uncertain future. As restoration practitioners, this is incredibly uncomfortable to tell someone who's paying to have this experience. And it's also really uncomfortable for the people paying to hear that from us. But you know what? If we're transparent about this, it strengthens the field as a whole, because now they understand the risks that are being taken with this and that they need to have an active involvement, not only during the program, but afterwards as well. Not everyone has access to a coral reef. So to increase accessibility, as part of our in-person Coralpalooza event, we launched in 2019 and 2020 Coralpalooza Digital, which was a free online resource talking about coral reef education and coral reef awareness and restoration programs. And we reached over 1,300 people in over 80 different countries, quite literally bringing coral reefs into people's homes. In water, our recreational programs regularly work with minority and underserved and underprivileged communities, and we want to find ways to do more of those. Finding a happy medium between an organization's needs and those of a volunteerist is not easy or straightforward. There is a certain amount of customer service that goes with it, but we are ultimately in the business of restoration. There are a lot of places internationally that have managed to navigate this, from Corales de Paz in Colombia, who created longer programs, so for volunteerists rather than short programs to their advantage. There are reefscapers in the Maldives who also benefit their local community. And then there's New Heaven Reef Conservation in Koh Tao, Thailand, who have created programs that increase profitability to the point where they no longer need grants for their bottom line. So as restoration becomes more globally practiced, these experiential eco and volunteer tourism programs will follow. I've changed my conclusion a little bit. I was really inspired, if you saw her, Dr. Triez's presentation from Indonesia. And I think that what she saw with regards to people kind of taking restoration into their own hands is something that we need to pay attention to. As the practitioners here, it's our responsibility to find these really motivated and driven people that we are inspiring and give them an outlet. Otherwise, they might find misguided but very well-meaning ways to try to help. So I hope that we all know a lot of these concepts already, but I hope that it's given us something to think about and discuss, and essentially recognize that just as we are a global network of practitioners, there is an even bigger global network of volunteers out there who want to help us. How can we harness them to absolutely everyone's advantage? Thank you so much for the time today, and I really hope that you enjoy Reef Futures 2022.